This is Mornings with Cassie McCullough on ABC Radio Sydney.
Yeah, so everyone knew there was going to be a rate rise announced by the Reserve Bank yesterday. Some were a little hopeful that it wouldn't be as big as it was, as we know, 0.5%. The biggest single rise in 22 years for a loan of, say, $500,000, that means an extra $200 a month. And that's just with this particular rate rise. There are more, we are told, on the way. Martin North is the principal at Digital Finance Analytics and often gives us his opinion on matters to do with the housing market. Good morning, Martin.
Hello.
What do you make of the situation that a lot of people are going to find themselves in now? As we were just talking about, there's been a lot of disruption to workforces. A lot of people have survived the last couple of years because of assistance from the government, and businesses are rebuilding themselves. It's a bad time for rates to start growing.
Well, it's really a perfect storm of issues, isn't it? Because households have one budget, and out of that budget they need to pay the mortgage or the rent and buy the petrol and, everything else that needs to be bought. And what we're seeing is that they're being pressurised from all angles. And so this mortgage rate rise is not welcome, but it was expected. The difficulty, of course, is there are going to be more of them, and probably quite a lot more. This is going to put a lot of people into significant financial pressure. And the question then is, how do they respond as individuals, and how do governments respond, and how do we work our way through this? I almost feel this is like another sort of crisis, a bit like COVID, but with a different set of drivers and outputs. We need to think of this in those terms, I think, because there are so many people just sailing so close to the wind at the moment.
People in anecdotal in conversations have raised the subprime mortgage loan issue that caused the GFC back in 2008, wasn't it, 2009? I mean, that's sort of ridiculously scary and fanciful, isn't it?
Well, we certainly know that a lot of households are paying bigger mortgages than previously, and therefore their repayments are more leveraged if rates go up than previously. We know that for sure. We also know, of course, the incomes have not been growing in real terms for a long, long time. We know that costs have actually been rising for pretty much everything, and inflation for non-discretionary items was well over 6% last time it was reported. So households are under significant pressures from multiple perspectives, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see mass defaults immediately, not least because people tend to prioritise the mortgage repayments or even rent repayments compared with other things. So, for example, in my surveys, I see things like people cutting back on dental treatment or not buying the clothes for the kids that they would have bought previously just to try and make ends meet. Also, we're seeing more people now saying, well, I can't any longer pay school fees, so I'm going to have to put my kids into public schools. So there are things that people can do. The banks also, of course, very keen to keep people in their homes too, and there are hardship schemes that the banks run if people get into difficulty. So if you do have huge pressures, talk to the banks. But the underlying issue here is that we've built ourselves a housing market that is way too expensive relative to incomes. That means the mortgages are very big, and I've always been saying, I've been saying for some time, the problem is when the tide goes out, you start to see where the problems are. As interest rates rise, this is going to actually put a lot of pressure on people. And ultimately, I think the banks probably were too generous in their lending. I think the regulators were too weak in their control of the system.
Well, there certainly was an invitation to by the Reserve Bank to imagine that for 2 or 3 years, these interest rates were going to stay at rock bottom.
Well, absolutely. So 2024 was when rates were going to start to move, but that was last November from the RBA. And, I remember Michael Zucker when he was, on the winning side, as it were, encouraging first-time buyers to go into the market now and get those incentives from the government to go and get a loan to be able to buy a first home. We have to recognise that over the last 2 or 3 years, the stimulus into the economy was massive. Partly it was due to COVID.
Needed. That was needed. I mean, the point was, and that was the Reserve Bank's intention, was to stimulate business, not to inflate the housing market.
Well, unfortunately, it inflated the housing market because, of course, property prices went up, 20-25% in some areas. People got much bigger loans, so the average loan is now 20% bigger than it was 18 months ago. And incomes have not risen by that same amount, so people were actually stretching themselves. And loans from the banks were debt-to-income ratios at 6, 7, 8, 9 times, which is astronomical. So we've built ourselves a very precarious situation now because of this. And with rates now expected to continue to rise, the markets are saying, well, the cash rate in a year's time could be at 4%. The RBA is saying probably 2 to 2.5%. So these are huge increases.
Well, are they, though? I mean, really, obviously it's going to hit people hard, but they are, in the context of history, not that enormous. It's the size of the mortgages that are enormous, not the interest rates. Could I just ask you where you think will be hardest hit in Sydney? Where do you think the hot spots of pain are going to be felt the most?
Well, I certainly, in my surveys, I'm seeing those southwestern suburbs, the high-growth suburbs, like Campbelltown and Liverpool, are where a lot of people who bought quite recently, quite a few of them were first-generation Australians coming into the country, and as well as first-time buyers. So those high-growth corridors is definitely where it's really hot. But I'd also highlight the Central Coast. I'm seeing a lot of people there who moved up there perhaps over the last year or two, got a big mortgage and maybe got a bigger property with a view away from the city, as it were. Some of those are now beginning to feel it too. And then the third group are the young affluents, the people who bought, for example, an apartment in Bondi, big mortgage, big income, but actually now the mortgage is beginning to consume more of their income, maybe 40 or 50% of their income, and they're in difficulty. So there are these hot spots around the place. Some regional areas too, like Orange, for example, are also very much there in the sights now. And if we model this going forward with rates continuing to rise, we're going to see the mortgage stress and pain spread and hit other areas too.
All right. Well, look, I mean, it is going to be a stressful time for a lot of people, and some of that will be felt by people who are renting, and also small business owners who are trying to keep all their inflationary pressures under a lid. That's going to be tough for them. So it's not just people who are in home ownership that are going to feel this. Martin, good to talk to you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Martin North, Principal of Digital Finance Analytics.